Welcome back to another Explainer. Today, we're diving into two absolutely wild extremes of human exploration. We're talking about one incredible triumph of celestial mechanics and one chilling, deeply perplexing earthly mystery. That's right, we're looking at the Apollo 10 lunar mission of 1969 and the incredibly tragic Dyatlov Pass incident from 1959.
But before we get into the details, we really have to ask a fundamental question. How exactly did strict mathematical calculations lead to complete success in the totally unforgiving vacuum of space, while unpredictable earthly nature caused such a chaotic, enduring disaster right here on our home planet? It's a fascinating study in contrasts, and it reveals so much about our drive to explore.
Okay, so here is our roadmap for the Explainer. First, Act 1, the Apollo 10 dress rehearsal and those crazy lunar navigation challenges. Then we pivot to Act 2, the Dyatlov expedition timeline, the search and forensic clues, and lastly, the competing theories that try to explain it all. Let's get to it.
Starting with Act 1, the Apollo 10 dress rehearsal, also known as the F mission of 1969.
So taking you back to an era of highly engineered environments where literally every single variable was calculated, the Saturn Apollo program launched Apollo 10 as the F mission. Basically, this was the ultimate dress rehearsal. The goal was to test every single component, every communication relay, and every procedure right up to the very edge of actually putting boots on the moon. To really grasp the immense stakes of this mission, just look at this number, 8.4. The lunar module actually descended to an astonishing 8.4 nautical miles. That's just over 15 kilometers above the lunar surface. I mean, they were literally a 12-minute ride away from the ground, but they had to pull up and return to orbit without touching down.
Moving on to lunar navigation challenges and the strict engineering limits they faced. Let's look at the actual hardware. Here you can see the lunar module, affectionately named Snoopy, approaching the command and service module Charlie Brown. They had just successfully tested critical rendezvous procedures right there in the lunar gravitational field. And remember, a feat like this had never been done before. Now, you might be wondering, why didn't they just go for it and land? Well, there's a famous joke from astronaut Gene Cernan that NASA short-fueled the module just to prevent them from making a rogue landing attempt. Funny, right? But the reality is, they didn't land for strict engineering reasons. They intentionally short-fueled the ascent stage so it would perfectly replicate the weight of a module that had already burned its main engine launching from the surface. On top of that, NASA needed way more data on lunar mass concentrations, or mass-cons, which were completely throwing off their orbit predictions. In fact, because of those unpredictable gravity anomalies, Apollo 10 ended up passing about 9.1 kilometers south of the planned landing site. And just to completely put that rogue landing myth to bed, astronaut Mike Collins noted that Commander Tom Stafford was an incredibly deliberate, conservative planner. He was the one actively championing this step-by-step testing phase. He knew for sure that mastering the rendezvous in lunar orbit was an absolute non-negotiable prerequisite for Apollo 11's success.
Okay, so Apollo 10 conquered the vacuum of space with math and engineering. But what happens when explorers face an unpredictable, invisible force right here on Earth? We're going to pivot this explainer back exactly 10 years to 1959. We're diving into what happens when human vulnerability meets the terrifying, uncontrollable extremes of a Siberian winter.
That brings us to Act 2, the Dyatlov expedition timeline, and their journey to Dead Mountain. We're shifting focus to the frozen, unforgiving Ural Mountains and the deeply perplexing fate of 9 highly experienced Soviet hikers led by Igor Dyatlov. This incredibly organized expedition quickly turned into a disaster. They set out on January 23rd, and by February 1st, they pitched their tent on the slopes of Kholat-Syakhl, which ominously translates to Dead Mountain. Sometime during the night of February 2nd, the entire group perished. Searchers didn't find the tent until February 26th, and what they found was wild. The tent was slashed open from the inside, pointing to a sudden, panicked escape into negative 25 degrees Celsius weather. And get this, they fled without proper clothing or even boots. Next up, the search and forensic clues, relying strictly on the clinical forensic facts. The aftermath left searchers with a chaotic scene spread over a whole kilometer. Looking impartially at the autopsies, there's a really stark divide among the victims. 6 of the hikers ultimately died of hypothermia, showing signs of severe frostbite. But the other 3? They suffered severe blunt force trauma. We are talking about massive chest fractures and depressed skull fractures, comparable to being hit by a car at high speed. Yet, Astonishingly, there were zero corresponding external lacerations or bruises to suggest any sort of fight or attack. Which leads us to our final section, competing theories and explanations, trying to explain this bizarre trauma.
So, how on earth do you explain blunt force trauma with no signs of a struggle? Over the decades, dozens of theories have popped up. To explain the sudden, frantic panic that made them slash their own tent, scientists often point to katabatic winds. Basically, these are incredibly powerful downslope gusts that can literally reach hurricane speeds. Imagine being in the pitch dark, the tent brutally battered by these winds and blowing snow. It could have easily created the terrifying sensation that they were being buried alive.
And that brings us to a physiological reality that explains one of the absolute most chilling details of the whole scene. Searchers found several hikers partially unclothed. Some were missing trousers, others had no coats, all in deadly sub-zero temperatures. Well, there's a known physiological response to severe hypothermia called paradoxical undressing. As thermoregulation fails, the brain malfunctions, giving victims a false burning sensation of warmth. It literally compels them to strip off their life-saving insulation. Now, we have to neutrally weigh the competing explanations for the trauma itself. The official 2020 Russian prosecutorial conclusion actually points to a localized slab avalanche. This model suggests that wind-deposited snow formed a super unstable slab that released right onto the tent, perfectly accounting for the massive chest injuries without any external wounds. Contrast that with the persistent fringe theories of secret military rocket testing. Now, those rely heavily on rumors of falling debris and missing radiation data. However, it's important to note that these military theories completely lack definitive physical debris at the campsite. Today, the clinical, forensic consensus strips away the supernatural and the sensational. Instead, it points to a horrific cascade of environmental failures. The hikers fled what they perceived as an immediate threat, likely a small avalanche or those extreme winds we mentioned. 3 of them suffered severe trauma from the snow impact or from falling into a rocky ravine in the dark. And those sensational details you always hear about missing eyes and a tongue, forensics concluded that was just the result of natural postmortem scavenging, since those bodies lay submerged in a creek bed for months. Ultimately, the bitter cold claimed everyone who survived that initial trauma. So this explainer really leaves us with something to think about. We've seen how the absolute precision of an Apollo orbit allowed us to literally tame the vacuum of space through sheer math and engineering. Yet the Dyatlov Pass serves as a tragic reminder of our fragile vulnerability to nature's earthly extremes, where one unpredictable shift in the weather can outmatch even the most highly experienced explorers. Does our drive to master the calculated extremes of space sometimes blind us to the chaotic, unpredictable dangers lurking right here on Earth? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I hope you found this contrast as absolutely fascinating as I did.